Hey guys, Youngblood with you for the 76th episode of the Inbox. Appropriate number considering we're getting up on the 4th of July. Starting off with a question from Todd Douglas. There still seems to be a large demand for a pocket carrier, especially for solo players. Is this an unrealistic expectation, or do you think that they will push something out down the road? So I look at this in two different ways. You're absolutely right. There is a very large demand for a pocket carrier. Something that can carry fighters long distances is something that they want to do. They've kind of pushed against it, but they've also been at the same time vague and kind of dismissive about it. To a point to where they haven't said it's not coming, just they haven't necessarily designed ships in that way. There was an answer in Ben's day where Ben was talking to Batgirl, where he was saying that there is a upcoming ship that's going to blow people's minds or something along those lines. I don't remember the phrasing at this point. I think it was 2 weeks ago. But my guess in that regard, considering we have most of the careers covered, and we already know about interdiction, that's the one thing we don't have in place today, at least in my mind, but we know it's going to be coming. This phrasing made it sound like it was something totally different. So I think it might be the pocket carrier we want, but I don't know. I'm not committing to that. I don't want to get anybody's hopes up because he certainly didn't say that. But my takeaway was I think that's what it might end up being. Now, if I was to put in a pocket carrier, I would make it very, very limited because that's the direction CIG seems to make this want to go. Almost like you might not be able to actually deploy fighters from it. Maybe it's more of a transport, and then you actually have to stop and dock and actually let your ships go out that way. I don't know the way it's going to be implemented, or I think what it could also be is just it has it could even have no weapons on it. It is purely a ship transport, and the only defense it has is either if you're bringing an escort or if you're able to scramble your fighters. That would be an interesting situation as well. But I don't think it's an unrealistic expectation to have that it's coming, but I wouldn't hold your breath. However, I think we may end up getting it. We'll just have to see. Michael Bigheart says, so if cargo can be jostled, does that mean that if I'm walking through a corridor that I will also be jostled? Will I be hurtled against a wall or staggered if the ship takes a direct hit to its hull? Yeah. The reason your cargo gets jostled around is because it's not locked down on a mag plate. And you're not locked down on a mag plate. Now, we may end up having mag boots that'll keep you safe, assuming that those are on, but that might slow you down. But yeah, I mean, that's why spaceships have seats and crew totals. Technically, you could put way more people in a ship than you would actually have seats. But atmospheric flight and doing a barrel roll may cause problems. Getting hit with a torpedo may cause problems. Crashing into an asteroid would probably cause some problems. So, you're going to be treated just like cargo, I would assume, unless you have mag boots on or some other way of actually holding tight. And that may end up being something that we can implement down the line. Is all of a sudden maybe you don't have mag boots, but if you know an impact is coming, maybe you can sort of brace yourself and hold onto a railing or something. Tom N says, personally, I think there's a ship roll gap that needs to be filled, either with a variant of a ship like a Connie or something smaller than a Polaris. When we talk about cargo escort, I tend to think about onesie-twosie cargo ships, but not about convoys. If you think about supplying planets and moons and are talking about multi-ship convoys of hull D and E's, for that, something bigger than fighters will be needed, but smaller than cap ships. In WW2 or World War II, they stopped using cap ships for convoys because they were not effective and became a liability, etc., etc., etc. When you're talking about whole D's and E's, those are some of the biggest ships in the game. So, as far as that's concerned, I don't think escorting a whole E with a Polaris is a stretch at all. I think that actually makes a lot of sense. A Polaris is fast. It's got a lot of turrets on it. Those turrets are pretty big. It can shoot missiles. It can shoot torpedoes. You can deploy a fighter. I think a Polaris is actually a really strong escort for a big ship that has a lot riding on it, i.e. cargo, like a whole D or a whole E. That being said, I think you're talking about smaller ships that probably cost less to deploy, and I think gunboats are really going to be kind of what's in that category. Something like, the Redeemer, for example, would be a really good option. The new Cutlass might be an interesting option. If you're talking long-distance travel, a couple Vanguards aren't really a bad plan either. So I think we have things that are there. I don't really see the role gap. I wouldn't mind seeing more in that gunship category, even though I think it's a pretty low priority. But I think we have what we're already looking for in the ships that we have today. The Slim Shady says, what would be the best small long-range combat ship that can do some exploration? I feel like a Hornet or a Sabre is good at combat, but it's not really long-range or versatile. You're right. The Hornet and the Sabre are both very focused. They're both going to be, shorter ranged. I bet they're probably maybe mid-range to say. We'll just kind of have to see how that ends up playing out. But either way, they're definitely not long-range. So I think we get down to what do you consider small. A Vanguard is still technically a fighter, and it can go long distances. So maybe, that's one of the options that you can end up using. Now, if you want something a little bit smaller, like a freelancer could potentially do that. The freelancer is a really good option for exploration and cargo. And if you opt for the mist version, then all of a sudden you get a little bit more combat capability. So, something in that range. The Cutlass Black may be an interesting option as well. It's supposed to have some low-emission engines, and when I hear that, I also think of efficiency, so that could be a possibility. So we'll just need to see what ends up coming, but I think either one of those could do well for you. Chris Drake says, I have a question about ship security. I'm concerned about being boarded unaware and being sniped in the pilot seat or worse, sabotage from within. Will the ship alert you to intruders on your ship? It probably. We already know that there's going to be some automated defenses available on some ships, so that, I think if you've got that sort of detection ability that's in place, you're probably going to be able to have something as simple as, intruder alert. I think more likely what it's going to be is it's going to be less specific to what you're talking about and more a general, maybe alert in the ship. Like the rear port airlock was opened, and then all of a sudden you're like, it's just me and Bill on this ship. Bill, did you open that airlock? No? Okay, we probably got somebody coming on board. So I think you're going to have that sort of thing going. But past that, I think you're also going to have the ability to lock your doors. We know you're going to be able to do that while you're landed. So I think that makes sense to kind of translate into when you're actually flying. The thing you probably have to worry about is if you end up being hacked and somebody ends up opening the door, maybe cutting it open or something like that. So yeah, you'll have some idea that it's happening, most likely, unless somebody does electronic warfare to prevent that from taking place. Ravenous Pathogen says, after seeing a few space-to-planet landings, we see them always appear to go through a gate of sorts. Do you think that we'll only be able to land on a planet from a designated gate above the planet, or will we be able to land on the planet from any point in orbit? You should be able to land from any point in orbit. What we saw from a long ways off was kind of a predetermined path that the ship was going to take for the CitizenCon demo, or maybe that was Gamescom. I can't even remember at this point. But yeah, you're going to be able to land from really anywhere. Now, how long it takes, where you're able to land, the points of interest, those things are going to change based on the planet and what's there and how far along in development we are. But you shouldn't be restricted on where you can actually enter the atmosphere. And our last two questions are patron questions, starting off with a question from Jiraiya. With the new air system, do you suppose we can have our hull... Let me try that again. With the new air system, do you suppose we then can have hull fractures plus all emergency gameplay from that, such as explosive decompression? Yeah, I do. I think that's going to be something that's actually implemented into the game. I think that's going to be some of the benefit of trying to repair things. So maybe you have a small hole, but the longer it goes on, it ends up tearing open even further. We know we've got airlocks in ships for a reason, because that sort of thing can happen. Now, is it going to be super, explosive? I don't know. We don't know what that's going to end up looking like. But yeah, hull fractures are going to have an impact. And we've already seen them developing things like atmosphere changes from room to room when a door opens. And that same technology is going to apply to the hull. And the last question is from Sketchy. He says, so you arrested someone, you put them in your cargo hold to hold them back to processing, but then they log out. How do you think CIG will handle that? I don't know. I think it's interesting because there's a gameplay balance there. It's not fun for a player to be locked in a holding cell while you do what you want with them. And I think they've always talked about gameplay over realism. So I think what you're going to probably end up seeing is if you end up putting into capture, you're able to probably, maybe start a new character or pay a bill ahead of time or something along those lines. But I think it's going to just swap to a point to where that person in the holding cell becomes an NPC for that player. And then you probably have some other path past that. I think they're probably going through the details on that because there's some potential exploits that they're going to need to be careful with. But I think ultimately what it's going to be is the bounty hunter still ends up getting the benefit of a character they're turning in. But then the other real player that you captured is probably going to end up continuing their gameplay in some other form. So that's this episode of The Inbox. If you guys have questions, get them in. Otherwise, stay tuned for more. Have yourselves a wonderful day and take care.